Breaker. Breaker. Armed suspect vandalizing historic property. I froze. A woman was yelling into her phone about me. I was only trying to unlock my 100-year-old family cabin with my own keys. Somehow, in her mind, I'd turned into a criminal. The HOA president was live-streaming my crime to hundreds of viewers while I stood there clutching my inheritance documents like an idiot. She was losing her mind over a set of house keys. My house keys. The absurdity was unreal. I'd driven 12 hours to finally come home, and within minutes, I was public enemy number one. SWAT sirens echoed somewhere in the distance. Comment below where you're watching, she shouted. You won't believe what happens next. The scent of sawdust and aging pine reached me before I even stepped out of my truck. After 3 months of endless drives between Chicago and this mountain cabin, handling probate files, lawyers, and court paperwork, I still wasn't ready for the rush of memories that scent triggered. My grandfather had built this place himself in 1920, and every summer of my childhood had been spent here learning to whittle, fish, and listen to his stories about early Pine Valley. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Something tells me property disputes feel different depending on the zip code. Catherine Thompson stood between me and my own front door like a guard at Fort Knox. Early 50s, salon blonde highlights, a crisp polo shirt embroidered in gold thread with HOA president. Her phone had been recording since the moment I turned into what should have been my driveway, notifications pinging so fast they blurred together. Sir, I need you to stay calm while we clear this up, said the SWAT team leader, his body cam blinking red in the afternoon light. He was clearly a veteran, someone who'd seen enough genuine emergencies to recognize suburban hysteria when he saw it. Ma'am, he continued, your initial report described multiple armed suspects. I'm only seeing one man with what looks like legal paperwork. Officer, this individual is attempting to break into our community heritage site, Karen shot back, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd chaired too many neighborhood meetings. We have records confirming this property was donated to the Pine Valley HOA for preservation. I reached into the passenger seat and pulled out a manila folder. Inside, my grandfather's death certificate dated 3 months and 2 weeks ago, probate documents with official seals, and property transfer forms with my name printed in block letters. All verified, notarized, and filed with the county clerk. These documents appear current and valid, the officer said, flipping carefully through each page. Do you have anything confirming HOA ownership, ma'am? For a brief 3 seconds, Karen's confidence cracked. Then she straightened and pointed at her phone. That paperwork is in process. This is an emergency action to stop the destruction of a historical landmark. What paperwork? I asked. My grandfather never donated this place. He left it to me, in his will. Her phone buzzed again, her viewer count now over 1,200. She wasn't talking to me anymore. She was performing for her audience, turning a private legal matter into a viral episode. The absurdity of it hit me. I was simply claiming my inheritance, yet I'd become the villain in someone else's reality show. The officer checked the footage from his body cam. Ma'am, in your 911 call, you claimed you saw weapons. Can you show us what you thought was threatening? Karen rewound her video and tapped the screen with one manicured finger. Right there. That metallic object catching the light. It looked dangerous. The officer leaned closer, then looked down at the keys dangling from my hand. Those appear to be standard residential keys, ma'am. Karen started to protest, then fell silent when he lifted the key ring and let it jingle softly in the quiet air. 25 minutes later, the SWAT unit packed up their gear, professionals who'd just spent their time defusing what turned out to be a toaster instead of a bomb. They left behind yellow caution tape draped across my porch railings, not as evidence, but as a polite boundary reminder while we sorted out ownership through legal channels. I sat on the wooden steps my grandfather had built sometime in the 40s, watching Karen pace along the property line, narrating every movement for her live stream audience. The whole thing felt surreal. 3 months ago, I'd planned to retire quietly here after losing my wife. Now I was unwillingly starring in a neighborhood soap opera I didn't sign up for. Karen's stream had drawn over 2,000 viewers and counting. The comments had split into camps, some demanding my arrest, others questioning Karen's claims, and a curious few asking about the cabin's real history. That last group got my attention. I realized I couldn't answer most of their questions. My grandfather had focused on teaching me how to live, not on recounting dates or documents. I knew he built this cabin by hand, that it had stayed in our family for more than a century, and that he'd wanted me to have it. But beyond that, the details were a mystery. Its role in the town's early growth and its possible historical value were blanks in my understanding that suddenly felt crucial. As the sun sank behind the pines, Catherine ended her live stream with a tight, polished smile. "Don't worry, everyone. Phase 2 begins tomorrow." I locked up the truck, looped the chain twice around the gate, and spread my paperwork across the kitchen table beneath the same lamp that had lit 4 generations of late-night choices. Sometime between midnight and dawn, a thick manila envelope appeared on my windshield, taped down so thoroughly it could have survived a storm. Across the front, bold red letters read, "Emergency Structural Violation Notice." The smaller print beneath it drained the warmth from my coffee. Inside were photos showing my cabin support beams cracked, splintered, and apparently on the verge of collapse. I walked the property line with the notice in one hand and my phone in the other, snapping tight frame shots of each suspicious area. Fresh metal shear marks gleamed along century-old wood. Silver scoring at the beam's base hadn't even begun to rust. Mortar smeared wet under my fingertips while the rest of the joints remained aged and sun-hardened. In frame 07, a blade groove cut sharp across the grain. Frame 12 revealed mortar from a different batch and color entirely. None of this came from time or weather. It was sabotage, done overnight, cleaned fast, and executed with professional tools to simulate an emergency. By morning, Catherine had transformed the cabin's entrance into something resembling a legitimate historical preservation site. Temporary signage guided passers-by to a folding table dressed in glossy brochures labeled Pine Valley Historical Preservation Society. The typeface and heavy cardstock mimicked official government paperwork. 2 middle-aged women, both in matching polos and laminated name tags, handed out flyers to the growing circle of curious onlookers. It looked polished, convincing, a community-driven effort staged with theatrical precision. The violation order demanded full compliance within 72 hours or immediate demolition by county authority. The deadline was intentionally impossible for real construction work, permits, inspections, materials. None could be arranged that quickly. But it was perfectly timed for someone looking to corner me into surrendering the property before I could respond. I started cataloging everything. Each scrape, each wet patch of mortar, every unweathered mark went into my phone's photo archive, evidence that would matter later. By noon, I noticed something new, high-end surveillance gear mounted on 3 trees surrounding the cabin. These weren't consumer-grade security cameras from a hardware store. They were commercial units with motion sensors, infrared capability, and wireless transmission antennas, the kind of tech you'd expect at a government site, not a volunteer heritage project. The volunteers smiled and handed out leaflets, but none could answer a single concrete question about the cabin's real history or its supposed connection to Pine Valley's development. Their responses circled vague talking points printed on their flyers. Everything looked official until you scratched the surface. Late in the afternoon, long shadows stretched across the faux heritage display. I moved closer and overheard Catherine on a phone call behind the booth. Her voice carried the brittle edge of someone under pressure. "Harold, I told you, this preservation project will succeed no matter what. My reputation depends on results. We can't afford to look like amateurs now, not after everything we've invested." Her words reframed everything. This wasn't about saving history. It was about her standing in Pine Valley's social ladder, her credibility, maybe even money tied up in promises she couldn't walk back. The heritage narrative looked more like a cover story for something driven by ego, pressure, and personal stakes. I spent the remaining daylight hours finishing a full photographic record before anyone could act on the notice. Every new angle reinforced the same conclusion: deliberate tampering disguised as emergency preservation. Professional sabotage wrapped in the appearance of civic duty. Still, I couldn't figure out what Catherine's ultimate plan was, or why she'd risk so much faking structural damage and coordinating a full-blown community deception campaign. As night crept over the ridge, the forest blinked with tiny red status lights from the cameras. The air felt watched. The booth was gone, but the countdown on that notice remained. What exactly would happen when the timer hit 0? The next morning, I drove into town. The Pine Valley County Records office occupied a squat brick building seemingly trapped in 1975, its fluorescent tubes buzzing like angry hornets above dented metal file cabinets older than half the residents. The clerk behind the bulletproof glass wore thick bifocals and the resigned look of someone who'd spent decades untangling bureaucratic knots for frustrated locals. When I explained my situation, her eyebrows rose in immediate recognition. "You're here about the Turner cabin, I assume," the clerk said, pulling a thick folder from beneath the counter. "Mrs. Thompson has been in 4 times this month, asking for what she calls clerical corrections and administrative updates to your family's file. She's been unusually persistent, claiming our documentation contains serious errors needing immediate attention." Her tone stayed polite, but the tightness around her mouth betrayed annoyance. Catherine's attempts to pressure the county into rewriting history hadn't gone unnoticed. Spread across the counter, the official records told a straightforward story: 100 years of continuous Turner family ownership. Deed transfers dating back to the original construction. Tax receipts showing consistent payments. Probate filings confirming my grandfather's legal right to name me as heir. Every page properly notarized, every seal intact. No gaps. No ambiguities. She even offered me $500, the clerk added quietly, glancing toward the security camera. Said it was for administrative consulting services. What she actually wanted was for me to correct your file to show community ownership instead of private inheritance. When I explained that altering county records without court orders is fraud, she accused me of lacking civic spirit. That small bribery attempt opened a trail I hadn't considered. I asked for any recent invoices or payments tied to the inspection that supposedly led to yesterday's violation notice. After checking with her supervisor, the clerk returned with documents that made my instincts snap to attention. An invoice from Heritage Preservation Consulting Services, billed to the Pine Valley Homeowners Association, dated the very same day as the emergency inspection. The transaction wasn't random, it was synchronized. The listed company's address traced back to a commercial mail drop, not an actual office. The invoice language was intentionally vague, broad enough to describe anything from fence painting to archaeological restoration. The timestamp of payment approval, hours before the inspection allegedly occurred, destroyed any illusion of coincidence. Digital analysis told an even clearer story. The metadata embedded in Catherine's violation photos showed they'd been taken with professional equipment, during narrow time windows that didn't match her claims of a spontaneous discovery. GPS tags, file creation times, and shutter settings all pointed toward a staged operation, not a genuine emergency. Out in the parking lot, Tommy Wilson caught up to me as I organized the evidence on my truck's tailgate. Pine Valley's veteran contractor, hands calloused, boots scuffed, had worked on nearly every historic property in the valley. He'd spent over 20 years helping my grandfather maintain the cabin. Aaron Turner, Sr., one of the most precise men I ever met, Tommy said, leaning against the tailgate. We documented every nail we drove, every repair, every update. Not once did he mention donating that cabin. Always talked about passing it on to you. His voice carried the authority of experience, and his words cut straight through Catherine's narrative. My grandfather hadn't just built a cabin, he'd built a legacy. For generations, the Turners had helped shape Pine Valley, from my great-great-grandfather's lumber mill that supplied the town's first homes, to the very planks beneath that cabin's floorboards. Tommy's frustration deepened. She's been pulling the same stunt with other families, he said. Told the Hendersons their memorial garden was now community property. Tried to take the Patterson playground because it was historically significant. Same pattern every time: official forms, fake urgency, legal intimidation, banking on folks too overwhelmed to fight back. His account transformed the situation from a neighborhood dispute into something calculated. Catherine was targeting long-established families, widows, retirees, anyone entangled in inheritance. The heritage narrative wasn't preservation, it was camouflage for property consolidation. Tommy opened a battered folder from his truck and spread inspection reports, maintenance logs, and permits across the hood like case evidence. Every repair your grandfather ordered, every inspection, is right here. County approved and clean. If she's claiming that place is unsafe, she'll have to explain why none of these evaluations ever raised a single concern. The documentation made it undeniable. Catherine's emergency findings directly contradicted 2 decades of professional assessments. The cabin had passed every safety and building inspection without issue. No cracks, no structural warnings, No signs of the decay she'd theatrically broadcast online. As the courthouse clock struck 6, Tommy closed the folder. "Demolition at sunrise," he said grimly. "She's already told half the town your cabin's a hazard." A gust of wind flipped open the back door of a white SUV idling a few spaces away. Papers scattered like startled birds, several skidding beneath my bumper. I gathered them and froze. Blueprints stamped Pine Valley Luxury Estates. Unit grid overlay stretched across the page. My parcel swallowed inside the new development's boundaries. Handwritten notes lined the margins. Start 6 months after obstacles cleared. Beneath the plans lay a consulting agreement tying Catherine directly to an investor group, complete with delivery bonuses and profit shares. The heritage emergency wasn't about preservation. It was land acquisition. Tommy's headlights followed close behind as I pulled into the driveway, his beams catching on the heritage preservation signs that now looked less like proud community markers and more like evidence tags at a crime scene. "I brought copies of every document your grandfather and I ever filed for this place," he said, lifting a thick folder filled with 2 decades worth of maintenance records, safety reports, and building permits. If Catherine wanted to claim structural issues existed, she'd have to explain why qualified inspectors never noticed them before. The evidence we'd gathered could dismantle her story in any legitimate hearing, but the demolition was set to begin in less than 12 hours. By sunrise, either our documentation would be vindicated, or the roar of bulldozers would erase everything we were trying to preserve. I set the folder on the passenger seat, started the truck, and called the sheriff. The first strike came before I even finished my coffee. 3 freelance clients terminated contracts within hours, each using the same carefully worded statement: concerns about ongoing community disputes. Someone had gone through my entire client list, feeding them lies designed to destroy my credibility just as legal bills were climbing past what I could manage. My phone rang non-stop, voices I'd known for years, regretful but resolute. Each conversation followed the same pattern: anonymous warnings about my unstable behavior and pending legal issues that might tarnish their company reputations. It was precision sabotage, economic warfare with surgical accuracy, mirroring the same calculated cruelty Catherine used on the cabin. By mid-morning, the mortgage company joined in, questioning whether my property's disputed legal standing or unpermitted structural changes might threaten loan security. The caller's knowledge of demolition orders and heritage claims was far too specific for any legitimate inquiry. The financial noose was tightening from every direction. Then came the insurance companies, hinting at possible denials for claims linked to community disputes or non-permitted alterations. The coordination was unmistakable. Catherine had studied my vulnerabilities and launched a full-scale pressure campaign designed to drain my resources before I could fight back. Rebecca Wilson found me that afternoon surrounded by printed termination notices, sitting on the cabin steps where my grandfather once taught me to recognize bird calls. As HOA treasurer, she'd kept her distance from Catherine's theatrics, quietly tracking procedural irregularities that had long troubled her. Her expression told me she'd finally connected the dots. "This crosses every line of acceptable conduct," she said, scanning the cancellation letters that documented my collapse. "Catherine's been twisting HOA rules to justify decisions way outside her actual authority. She's using proxy votes obtained through deceit, holding emergency meetings without proper notice, and approving expenditures that would never survive legal review." Rebecca's analysis laid bare a calculated exploitation of governance systems meant to prevent this exact abuse. Catherine had buried her misconduct in procedural fog, paperwork and loopholes, weaponizing bureaucracy to fulfill her private ambitions under the guise of community improvement. "Maybe I should just quit," I said quietly, staring at the messages from clients ending years of collaboration. "This fight's destroying everything I rebuilt after my wife died. I can't lose both my home and my livelihood over this." Rebecca's reply carried the weight of someone who had seen this strategy before. "That's exactly her plan, to drain you until you can't keep going. She's counting on exhaustion winning before you uncover what she's really doing." Her tone revealed growing fear about what Catherine's influence might do to Pine Valley if left unchecked. As the only board member with access to full financial data, Rebecca had been documenting unauthorized transactions and policy breaches that revealed a disturbing pattern: community resources redirected for undisclosed personal profit. By nightfall, the security truck made another slow pass. I already had the plats and contracts ready. Rebecca arrived with the HOA ledgers. Tommy brought the permit history. We didn't need luck anymore, just a clean paper trail and daylight. The so-called heritage preservation effort was a smokescreen for a high-end real estate play meant to enrich Catherine while gutting Pine Valley's identity. Every meeting, every vote, every appeal to neighborhood unity had been theater, carefully staged manipulation paving the way for the displacement of lifelong residents in favor of luxury buyers. Would you like me to make it slightly tighter for a voiceover, same meaning and tone, but more rhythmic for spoken delivery? Tommy's headlights trailed mine up the driveway, catching the heritage preservation signs that now looked more like crime scene markers than neighborhood pride. I brought copies of every document your grandfather and I ever filed on this place, he said, hefting a thick folder of records, 2 decades of maintenance logs, inspections, and permits. If Catherine claimed structural defects, she'd have to explain why licensed professionals never found them. The file was strong enough to crush her story in any real hearing, but the demolition order meant we had under 12 hours to stop the destruction. At dawn we'd either be proven right or hear bulldozers erase our proof. I set the folder on the seat, started the truck, and called the sheriff. The first wave of sabotage hit before my morning coffee cooled. 3 clients canceled contracts within hours, each using the same phrase about concerns over community disputes. Someone had systematically warned my entire network, timing it for maximum damage as legal costs rose. The phone rang non-stop with polite apologies from longtime partners, all repeating the same script, anonymous calls about my unstable behavior and pending legal issues that might taint their reputations. It was precision economic warfare, the same cold method Catherine used on the cabin. By mid-morning, the mortgage company called, questioning my property's disputed status and structural violations. The representative knew details about demolition orders and heritage claims no legitimate lender should have. The financial trap was tightening. Insurance agents followed, hinting that policies tied to community disputes might be void. The coordination was too exact to be random. Catherine had mapped my weak points and was squeezing until I couldn't fight back. Rebecca Wilson found me that afternoon, surrounded by printed cancellations, sitting on the cabin steps where my grandfather once taught me bird calls. As HOA treasurer, she'd stayed professional through Catherine's tantrums, quietly noting procedural abuses. Her face showed she'd finally seen enough. "This has crossed every ethical line," she said, scanning the letters. "Catherine's been twisting HOA rules to push actions far beyond her authority. Proxy votes gained through lies, emergency meetings without notice, expenses approved through violations that wouldn't survive a basic audit." Her review exposed deliberate exploitation of community bylaws, bureaucracy turned weapon to serve a personal agenda. "Maybe I should just give up," I said, staring at the breakup emails. "This fight's wrecking what I rebuilt after my wife died. I can't lose both my house and career." Rebecca's voice hardened. "That's exactly what she's counting on, to drain you until you can't keep going. If you quit, she wins before anyone sees what she's really planning." Her alarm grew as she described the records she'd uncovered, unauthorized transfers, policy breaches, and financial manipulations hidden behind technical language. Catherine wasn't preserving history, she was erasing it for profit. By nightfall, the security truck crept by again. I already had plats and contracts ready. Rebecca brought the ledgers, Tommy the permit history. We didn't need luck anymore, just daylight and a clean trail of evidence. The heritage preservation campaign was a facade, a calculated real estate scheme meant to enrich Catherine and replace Pine Valley's longtime residents with wealthy outsiders. Every meeting, every rule, every speech about unity had been theater, carefully scripted to mask the takeover. Sheriff Miller stepped forward, holding up official paperwork that directly refuted Catherine's supposed authority over the heritage preservation project. The legal text was formal yet unmistakably clear. Catherine had no lawful right to conduct any activity on disputed land. Her reaction was instant, and revealed just how unstable her campaign against my inheritance had become. Instead of acknowledging the sheriff's authority or seeking any kind of legitimate resolution, she ripped the microphone off its stand and launched into what could only be described as a public meltdown. "You people don't understand what's at stake here," Catherine shouted, her voice breaking through the speakers in harsh, distorted bursts. "This community's entire history depends on protecting this landmark from corporate developers who want to erase everything we've built together." The irony would have been laughable, if it weren't destroying the lives of ordinary families who'd come expecting a cheerful community event. Catherine's tirade exposed her projection clearly. She'd convinced herself her own property scheme was a noble crusade. As Sheriff Miller approached with a court order, Catherine clutched the microphone cord like a lifeline, backing away in panic while continuing her rambling defense of actions the court had already ruled illegal. The sound cable stretched taut, then whipped free, wrapping around her legs and sending her crashing backward into the Heritage Celebration cake display. The impact was spectacular. She plowed through an entire table of pastries and frosting, her navy blazer now plastered in icing that would never wash out. The crowd went from polite attention to stunned silence. Catherine staggered to her feet, covered in frosting and crumbs, her professional composure utterly ruined. Children whispered to their parents, adults exchanged bewildered looks, realizing their community leader was unraveling before them. "You have to see these letters of endorsement," Catherine screeched, thrusting sticky papers toward the sheriff. "The mayor supports our preservation efforts. The city council knows the importance of this site." Sheriff Miller glanced at the documents, and his expression shifted instantly. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "this letterhead uses a city seal retired 2 years ago. Official correspondence doesn't look like this anymore." The crowd didn't need further explanation. Whispers rippled outward, spreading faster than Catherine could react. Parents exchanged uneasy glances. Vendors began dismantling tents and booths with the silent efficiency of people eager to avoid involvement in a scandal. Desperate, Catherine grabbed the mic again, just as the sound system emitted an ear-splitting squeal of feedback that froze everyone in place. For 2 full seconds, the festival fell into absolute silence. When the noise cut out, the only sound was Catherine's ragged breathing and the squelch of frosting under her shoes. Then came the first shout. "You lied about the mayor's support," a parent yelled. "What else have you been lying about?" another voice demanded. The mood shifted in an instant, from confused sympathy to open anger. Residents who'd once cheered Catherine now turned away, furious at being manipulated into supporting something built on deception. Parents gathered their kids and headed for their cars. Vendors demanded immediate payment for unpaid services. Catherine's boyfriend, still dressed in his imitation security uniform, tried to calm the chaos, waving his arms and urging people to stay for the educational programs. But his lack of authority was obvious. Families brushed past him without a word. Rebecca Wilson appeared beside me, phone in hand, recording quietly. "I've been tracking every expense for this event," she said. "Vendor fees, rentals, permits, all paid out of HOA funds that were never approved for use here." Tommy joined us near the abandoned information booth, where flyers fluttered in the breeze. "I talked to some of the contractors," he added. "Catherine's been promising them more work on preservation projects that don't exist, and she's budgeting money the HOA can't even access without a vote." As we watched, the once celebratory festival dissolved into confusion and retreat. 4 components, the prosecutor summarized, gesturing to a projected chart. Fabricated emergencies, manufactured evidence, falsified credentials, and financial misappropriation. Phone records confirmed multiple staged 911 calls. Photographs showed intentional destruction passed off as weather damage. Expert witnesses verified counterfeit seals and fake licensing numbers. Bank statements revealed unauthorized transfers exceeding $20,000. The defense tried to frame Catherine's actions as overzealous community activism, misguided but not criminal. They argued her intentions were rooted in preserving local culture, not in personal profit. But the evidence of her involvement with development investors dismantled that claim entirely. Judge Mills's sentencing reflected both the gravity of the crimes and the deeper betrayal they represented. "Mrs. Thompson," she said evenly, "your abuse of public trust and manipulation of community authority constitute a fundamental violation of democratic responsibility at its most local level." Catherine's sentence: 6 months of community service focused on transparency and governance education, 2 years of supervised probation, full restitution for all misused funds, and prohibition from any HOA or civic office during her supervision period. She was ordered to repay the total amount of fraudulent consulting fees, event expenses, and fake security costs, plus an additional $5,000 in penalties and legal fees. Her real estate license was suspended pending state review, and she was required to assist investigators in uncovering her out-of-state development partners. After the trial, I returned to the cabin for the first time in weeks, finally free from the constant pressure of surveillance and litigation. The air felt lighter, the silence real. Tommy Wilson waited in the drive, tools and materials in hand, ready for the symbolic restoration we'd promised ourselves once the truth was settled. "Time to put this place back under the right name," he said, nodding toward the bogus Pine Valley Community Heritage Center sign Catherine had installed. The removal wasn't angry or triumphant, just deliberate and precise, the way healing often begins. We photographed every piece for record-keeping before unbolting the plaque that had falsely rewritten our family's history. The cabin finally belonged to the Turners again, not just by blood or inheritance, but by justice restored. The mounting brackets had been installed with professional-grade precision, evidence that Catherine's deception had been meant to endure. Beneath her counterfeit plaque, we uncovered my grandfather's original cabin marker, "Private cabin since 1920, Turner family homestead." The aged timber and hand-painted letters had been shielded from years of weathering by her overlay, preserving the authentic family sign through months of legal turmoil. Seeing that original emblem hit harder than expected. Catherine's elaborate narrative had nearly made me question my cabin's authenticity, but the craftsmanship of my great-great-grandfather's work was undeniable proof of a genuine family legacy deeply rooted in Pine Valley's early growth, not some convenient story crafted for court. As we tightened the final screws, Rebecca arrived at the gate holding a document stamped and sealed. "The community's vote was unanimous. They've endorsed your landmark application," she said, handing me the certified resolution. That approval represented a complete reversal of Catherine's lies. Where she had tried to use fabricated heritage claims to seize ownership, the community now stood behind legitimate preservation, one that honored both the land's history and rightful ownership. Ironically, her fraudulent crusade had achieved the recognition she'd falsely declared from the start. Tommy's documentation of the cabin's construction details strengthened our application with professional accuracy no fake consultant could rival. His photos captured hand-hewn logs, traditional joinery, and period-accurate features reflecting Pine Valley's early settlement craftsmanship, a time when builders worked for generations, not seasons. Rebecca explained the board's new reforms: mandatory financial audits, community approval for spending above $500, and strict term limits for all officers to prevent any future power abuses like Catherine's. Those measures would safeguard the HOA's integrity while protecting neighborhood autonomy. By late afternoon, long shadows stretched across land that was now indisputably mine. I replayed my grandfather's old voicemail, his voice soft but steady from the week before he passed. "Take care of that place, Aaron. It's not just timber and nails. It's our family's heart, and it's your turn to protect it." That weight of responsibility felt different now that I fully understood how close I'd come to losing everything our family had built across 5 generations. Catherine's scheme hadn't only targeted my inheritance, it had aimed to erase the physical and emotional proof of our contribution to Pine Valley's growth, the evidence of who we'd been. Standing on the same porch steps where my grandfather once taught me bird calls and my great-grandfather carved his initials still visible in the railing, I realized her sabotage had only deepened my bond to this place. The legal war was over. The lies had collapsed, and the truth had endured, reinforced by a community that now valued authenticity over spectacle. Catherine's conspiracy had failed completely, leaving behind stronger rules, wiser neighbors, and renewed respect for honesty in leadership. What remained was my promise, to guard not just the property, but the stories and memories that made it a living landmark instead of just another old cabin in the hills. Pine Valley had survived her fraud and emerged more resilient, with institutions built on clarity and trust. The question now was how to preserve that strength for future generations, rather than slipping back into the complacency that had allowed deception to thrive. A year later, the cabin finally functioned exactly as my grandfather envisioned. The porch had become a gathering place, hands-on lessons in woodcraft, stories traded over coffee, and laughter that carried down the hill. What began as a legal formality had turned into a standing tradition. The first Saturday of every month, open tables of tools and photographs, a coffee urn that never emptied, and a glass jar for memory notes scrawled on index cards. By mid-morning, the porch buzzed with quiet industry. 8-year-old Emma Patterson ran her fingers along a strip of pine and oak, tracing the wood grain like reading a new alphabet while her grandmother compared knot patterns to a table built in Pine Valley's first lumber camp. Inside, the cabin's small speaker looped recordings, Mrs. Delgado recounting the winter of '58, Mr. Nwan explaining why a mortise and tenon joint outlasts nails and screws, and my grandfather's voice reminding, "Always sand with the grain if you want your work to last." Visitors often stopped mid-task to listen, the way museum-goers do when an artifact story suddenly feels personal. Rebecca kept the event organized without ever seeming hurried, sign-in sheets, pencils, spare goggles, everything quietly under control. She had the gift of finishing one thing while already preparing the next. Tommy drifted between workstations, steadying wobbly benches, swapping saw blades, and showing a teenager how to square an angle on a century-old miter box that had framed countless windows. His safety tips always sounded more like encouragement than warning. And Marcus, still shaping the same piece of pine he'd started 3 sessions ago, refused to let machines steal the patience his great-grandfather's joinery demanded. His hand-cut dovetail gleamed like amber as he brushed away a fine curl of sawdust and reset his line with deliberate care. When the excess curled away in one clean ribbon, he didn't celebrate. He just smiled slightly and checked his angle. The house carried its own scents: warm pine resin, coffee, leather gloves, and the faint sweetness of paste wax from a tin that someone kept opening and closing like it held a secret. Out back, the talk moved at the pace of handwork, a quiet exchange about when things were repaired instead of replaced. A retired electrician described knob and tube wiring as though reciting folklore. A middle schooler took notes like she'd been waiting all year to hear it. When the light finally turned the ridge the color of brass, I pulled down a small wooden box from the corner shelf. Inside was the hand-forged nail that had worked loose during the festival chaos, darkened by a century of weather and months riding in my pocket. I'd been holding on to it, waiting for the moment when putting it back would feel like it belonged to the story, not the end of one. Tommy ran his thumb along the beam, counting the old hammer blows by touch. "Right there," he said. "That's your spot." I pressed the nail into place and drove it home. The sound, sharp, clean, final, landed in my chest like a key turning in an old lock. The room quieted on its own. Everyone drifted back to their benches, softer now, like a crowd after an anthem. Evening slid down the slope in long blue strokes. Families opened picnic baskets at the yard's long table. Kids wandered toward the pond with borrowed poles, learning patience through motion and stillness. On the porch, a young dad snapped a photo of his mother's handwriting beneath an old mill photo, promising to digitize it for the memory jar. Inside, the speaker crackled and caught a clear bit of Mr. Alvarez talking about roofs you inherit rather than own. Someone murmured, "Yeah." My phone buzzed against the railing, news that the former HOA president had been charged in a near-identical fraud across state lines. Same tricks, forged urgency, fake letterhead, shortcuts from people who never had to live with their work. I let the screen dim. That could wait for tomorrow. Tonight belonged to the ones who'd stayed. A cheer rose from the pond when a bobber dipped and ran. 2 kids argued about who'd set the hook and settled it the easy way. One held the line, the other worked the net, both grinning like they'd won something that mattered. Their laughter bounced off the trees that had been watching scenes like this for 100 years. I made one last round of the porch, checked the latch on the tool chest, and looked up at the beams my great-great-grandfather had notched with patience instead of a nail gun. We'd added new braces where the code demanded and ran modern wiring through the old paths, safety woven into tradition. The cabin felt strong but still human, which was the point. People packed up slowly, the way you do when leaving means something. Emma tucked a curl of cedar shaving into her pocket like a keepsake. Marcus slid his dovetail into the practice socket, nodded, already marking his next cut for next month. Rebecca left a neat stack of cards from the memory jar, names, dates, and even a recipe for sawdust filler I'd never seen. Tommy locked the gate and tossed me the key like he'd been doing it forever. When the final car's taillights disappeared around the bend, the cabin exhaled. You can hear it if you've lived with a place long enough, the small shifts of air inside cooling wood, the gentle knocks you stop mistaking for ghosts. I sat on the step where my grandfather once taught me to listen for trout feeding at dusk and let the evening settle. Mission complete. "Grandpa," I said to the trees, because that's where the important words always went. The place is safe. The work is honest. The stories will keep moving, quietly, the way they should.